Well, once again, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this evening's webinar. Tonight, we're really pleased to welcome Christopher Price, who will be discussing the role that grazing animals can have in restoring habitats in conservation and rewilding settings. First, as ever, I just want to introduce a couple of us who are on the call tonight from the Yorkshire Rewilding Network Committee, and particularly for those who have joined for the first time this evening. I'm John Hartshorn, and we also have the network's chair, Jeff Davitt. He'll be facilitating questions and answers. And as you can see, we're using Zoom. I just want to reassure you all, as ever, that you're all muted and your cameras are off. If you'd like to put any questions forward for Christopher to answer at the end of his presentation, please use the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom window. Jeff's going to monitor any questions that come in, he'll grab them, and he will put them to Christopher at the end of his talk. Just before I hand across to Christopher, a quick reminder about our aim. And a little bit of a reminder about the website and the Twitter feed for anyone who's certainly here for the first time tonight. The network's a registered charity that was launched on August 1st last year by a small group of volunteer committee members. And it has the overall aim of bringing together anyone across Yorkshire who has an interest in rewilding at all scales and from right along the rewilding spectrum. And that's with the intent of inspiring one another, sharing knowledge and experience, and particularly connecting people, and generally trying just to do our bit to help Yorkshire develop into a more nature-rich and more sustainable region. We've run a series of monthly webinars from around October last year, and we certainly have another one planned for late May called In Praise of Ponds. After that, I think the warm sunny evenings of summer will likely be keeping you all out of doors. So we plan to put some more focus towards in-person events for later in the year, when hopefully the COVID restrictions should allow us to do such things. And we'll also be starting to plan throughout the summer a webinar program for the autumn when the dark evenings return again. We will, as ever, publicize all our events on the website, through the Twitter feed, and in the various newsletters and mail shots that we send out. So do keep an eye out for those. And if you're not signed up for the newsletter yet, go to the Join Us page on the website and fill in the form, and you'll be able to receive the newsletters and the mail shots that we send out about events. There's also a contact us page on the website if you've got any suggestions for us. And of course, if you're a Twitter follower, you can join the 714, or I think it's actually now 715 since I wrote this, followers of the network on Twitter. And if any of you've got a topic that you'd potentially like to present to the network as a future webinar, or to produce a story or a project report for the website, do please get in touch with us. Doesn't matter whether you're a rewilding landowner, a farmer who's putting some measures in place to improve ecology on the farm, or perhaps you're from another conservation organization or charity or a community group, might even be a student or an academic researcher. We're interested in anything that's of relevance to rewilding in Yorkshire and right across the diverse range of habitats, including urban areas. So email us with your idea and we can certainly discuss it further from there. We've also actually got a space on the website for short blogs. So again, if anyone's got a topic they'd like to write a short blog about, drop us a line and we'll see if it would work well as a blog on the website. Now, as ever, I always say this, we are a volunteer-run charity, so if you enjoy this evening's presentation, we'd be extremely appreciative of any donations you might be able to make that can help us with our running costs. And you can do this on the website through the donate page. All right, that's enough from me. Time to introduce Christopher Price. So Christopher is the Chief Executive of the Rare Breed Survival Trust, and he has a long-standing interest in ecological restoration, particularly through the use of grazing animals and their role in providing some important ecosystem functions and processes. So Christopher, if you are all revved up and ready, turn your screen on, unmute your microphone, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, John, and everyone out there in Yorkshire and presumably beyond. As John said, I'm Chief Executive of the Rare Breed Survival Trust, an organisation that exists to conserve and promote our native livestock breeds. This time last week, I was talking to the Norfolk Agricultural Association, who I do regard as being very much at the other end of the livestock sector. But I think one of the great excitement about working in the livestock sector is how diverse it is, how many different ways it appeals to so many different people. But now I'm going to talk for the next half-hourish or so about why we should be using native livestock for rewilding projects. I'm not going to use any slides. To my mind, whilst PowerPoint corrupts, absolutely. So it's just going to be me you're looking at for the rest of the talk. We're talking about the use of native breeds in rewilding. I'm not going to spend ages talking about what we mean by rewilding, but I do think that in this context, it's useful to spend a bit of time talking about it. Now, I don't share the views of many academics who work in this area, who try to go and devise a pure definition of rewilding. I just don't think it's helpful. First of all, there isn't really anywhere that is wild or has been wild for a long time to do rewilding. Secondly, you have to accept that humans are going to be everywhere. Humans are going to have an impact on things, if not directly, then indirectly. So you're moving further away from any sense of real wildness or self-willed land. And also, I think perhaps most importantly, things have changed. You know, it's all very well talking about Pleistocene rewilding and all the different concepts, but many of the keystone species that created the habitats that we want to restore or just cherish no longer exist. You know, we are working in an imperfect, human-dominated world, and there's no real point in pretending otherwise. So when I talk about rewilding, what I'm really meaning is we're talking about land management that focuses on limited intervention, places a significant emphasis on natural processes, and generally is something that's done at landscape scale. It's that sort of woolly, what I'm talking about, which I hope makes sense in this context. Anyway, though, much of what we want in a rewilded world will be delivered by animals. You can't, I suppose you can have rewilding without there being animals, but it's not as exciting or as enthralling or enchanting as it could be. Partly it's because of the animals themselves, but also it's because of the effect they have. They create the disturbances that create the new habitats, that create the sort of the cycles in the land. They disperse the pollens and the seed that again create that more of a mosaic of habitats and things. They just generally make the landscape more energized, more exciting. Now, ideally, you probably would want to go and use the animals that were there originally, that created the ecosystem you care about, to help recreate it. But often that's not really going to be possible. And there's two big reasons for that. Firstly, because they're extinct. We don't have aurochs anymore, let alone some of the more earlier, bigger, scarier animals that so influenced our habitat. And in some cases, even if they do exist nowadays, they aren't always acceptable in smaller landscapes or close to areas of human activities. You know, even some of the horned cattle breeds may not be appropriate for that. And if you think of the tensions and conflicts around a wild boar in the Forest of Dean, you know, it's not always possible to use wild animals or traditional wild animals if you've got them. So what else do you do? Can you do? Well, you can use proxies, and you talk about or hear about people bringing back bison to the UK. Bison not having been in the UK since the Ice Age. Aurochs disappeared at the start of the Ice Age. They came back. Bison didn't. Or you can try breeding back to go and create things that have gone extinct. But to date, attempts at that haven't gone great. Many of you will know about the Heck brothers in Nazi Germany, who did try to go and recreate the aurochs, but didn't get anything particularly close to it. Looked a bit like it, but genetically it was miles apart. There are more realistic work being done by Rewilding Europe under the Taurus project, which might bring back something similar to the aurochs, but it's still a massive exercise and unpredictable. And I would say, is it really necessary? Do we need to be using proxies? Do we need to be breeding back or trying to recreate these missing animals? Because many of our domesticated livestock species are essentially the same species or very close to those species that have been lost. And logically, the ecological function of these domestic animals should be very similar to their ancestors, or indeed their extant relatives. And thinking it through, the key differences are really only going to be ones that are the consequences of husbandry. That could influence social structures, it might influence mating choices, it might even influence herd behavior in certain circumstances. But does it really change the purposes for which you would want those animals in the first place? We do have something of an example for this, and indeed it's in the north of England. Many of you will know the wild cattle of Chillingham. If you don't, they are a herd of white cows. They were enclosed, I think, about 600 years ago, when they've been left to their own devices. They're called wild because they are aggressive little buggers. They're not bred or husbanded in any meaningful way. They proceed on the basis of natural selection, and they operate on a large scale. So you can see how so-called domesticated animals will operate if they're left on their own for a bit. If they're allowed to go and live more wild, they come back and they restore the sort of exhibit the sort of behavior that we would want. There are further advantages in using native breeds, which I'll come on to in a moment or explore in more detail, in that if they're kept in the right way, they can make you money, and they can also be more acceptable to existing human populations. People will generally find it more comfortable to live with cattle and pigs nearby than they will with, say, wolves. And in the fallen world where we have to adopt a more pragmatic approach, that can itself be quite important. So, having recognised that maybe your rewilding project can be done with native livestock, let's talk a bit about the attributes that those livestock have. I think the starting point, and something which isn't always appreciated, and indeed not that long ago I was talking to a grazing officer from a wildlife trust who I was surprised hadn't appreciated the difference between different species. But anyway, let's start with sheep. Sheep are highly selective grazers. With their little mouths, they're able to pick the sweetest and most nutritious plant species from a sward. Their hooves are small and relatively light, so they compact the ground in a certain way. They are evolved for a mountainous environment, and they can suffer from foot problems and indeed from the effect of flies in a lowland setting. But appropriately managed, they can be useful animals. For example, in heathland restoration, they can be summer grazed to reduce the expansion of scrub and promote heather growth, which they will tend to only eat in winter. Cattle are probably more useful than sheep in terms of their impacts on vegetation. Though they'll avoid certain species, their larger mouths make it harder for them to discriminate between preferred plants and less palatable ones. They're well equipped to graze longer grasses and herbs. They create a variable sward structure benefiting a whole host of species, and their dung is also valuable for invertebrates, and their heavy feet can break up compacted ground to provide seeding opportunities for plants. Ponies have many of the benefits of cattle grazing when used at similarly low densities, and have the advantage of generally being naturally resistant to parasites and disease. They do tend to create latrine areas, which can cause localized enrichment of the soil. So they're generally best used on larger sites or indeed for shorter periods of time. But like cattle, they will browse as well as graze, and will not preferentially eat the flowering heads of plants in the way that sheep do. Goats as well can both graze and browse. Their narrow muzzles and their flexible upper lips allow them to be highly selective, and their agility enables them to reach a wider range of terrain than sheep can. There's also pigs. When we're talking about conservation grazing, you generally think of sheep, cattle, and equines, but pigs can play a really important part in conserving and managing, particularly woodland and other habitats. People tend to go and see pigs as being purely destructive, but contrary to this popular belief, they don't uproot everything. They willingly graze, browse, and consume berries and fungi. They will take invertebrates, which helps to help create and maintain a mosaic of bare ground and herb-rich pastures and shrub layers. And these behavioural characteristics that the pigs exhibit and their resulting impact are almost impossible to create using other forms of management. Their rooting behaviour can clear dense ground vegetation such as bracken, reducing the need for weed control and creating seed belts for natural regeneration. So that's the variety of grazing impacts different breeds can have. But it's also important to recognise that whilst there's differences between the different species, the breeds within those species can have their own impact as well. So it's not a matter of just saying any cow. Different cows will have a different impact. And the impact that our native breeds of cow have, I think, is particularly important. So staying with cows, before the 1950s and the onset of the CAP in the 1970s, which encouraged farmers to maximise their yield, livestock had to be bred to grow and reproduce on relatively low inputs. A lack of affordable feed or artificial fertilisers meant that animals had to be thrifty and hardy. And those are the sort of characteristics that work in favour of conservation. The beef breeds are probably best suited to conservation grazing because the production of meat can more easily be sustained on low quality pastures. Upland breeds such as Highlands, Galloways, Welsh Blacks and beef shorthorns are all commonly used for conservation grazing purposes. Even breeds considered to be dual purpose such as the Redpole or Shetland can also thrive in conservation at grazing systems. Moving on, native breed sheep can be divided into a number of categories, each with, again, their own attributes. The primitive upland, hill and heath breeds can all, in their own ways, make significant contributions to conservation, although much will depend on the particular terrain and vegetation on which they've been reared. The lowland breeds, though, tend to thrive more on improved grass and are now largely unable to do well on anything else, although there are exceptions. Native breed ponies are hardy and have the advantage of being exempt from much of the regulation that accompanies the keeping of farmed livestock. And they can adapt to a whole range of difficult environmental conditions and tolerate UK weather perfectly well. There is this, misplaced presumption that there's certain parts of the UK where UK native breeds can't thrive or survive, and so people feel the need to import Polish ponies, Conics, on the grounds that only they can do it. You hear less of it now, and quite rightly so, because that argument is nonsense. To say that an Exmoor pony can't thrive on Exmoor or a Dartmoor pony can't thrive on Dartmoor is just foolish. And if you start hearing conversations about how Conics can survive better in damp conditions or colder or warmer climates or whatever, have a look at the conditions where in that part of Poland where Conics come from. It's a lot drier and a lot more of an even temperature than most of the UK. There is nothing special about Conics. The only thing that makes them interesting is their heads look a bit like the head of the tarpan being the prehistoric pony. Now, if you want to use ponies, native breeds are absolutely fine. As you might have gathered, that's a bit of a bugbear of mine. Pigs. Wild and domestic pigs were once common in the British woodland landscape. Traditional breeds like the Gloucester Old Spot, the Oxford Sandy and Black, the British Saddleback and the Tamworth tend to be hardier, more suitable for feeding on a variety of food foraged for forage themselves. They also tend to be less prone to sunburn. If you think of the breeds I've just mentioned, most of them are dark and hairy. It's the modern, largely continental pink breeds that suffer in the sun. And being more varied in their appearance, because they've been developed under different commercial pressures, they tend to be so much more varied in their appearance. Now, they add to the quality of the landscape. They also, they also, having been bred for without such a focus on their reproductive rates and the need for low-fat carcasses, tend to have much higher fat levels, which probably accounts for their hardiness. Most of them are able to tolerate being outwintered, providing they've got sufficient food. But although native livestock may be wonderful for pure rewilding projects because of the environmental impacts they have, because of what they do for nature, we shouldn't be cherishing them just because of what they do for nature. We should also be cherishing them because they're part of nature. Livestock are just as much a part of biodiversity as wild animals, and this is a point which I think is often not fully appreciated. We all think we know what we mean by biodiversity. The UN Convention on Biodiversity defines it as, quote, the variability among living organisms from all species. And it divides it into 3 different elements: diversity within the species, diversity between species, and the diversity of ecosystems. Now, as I hope you've spotted, there is nothing in any of that that limits biodiversity to purely what is found in the wild. It encompasses all living things, including what's kept for agricultural purposes. And importantly, the signatories of the Biodiversity Convention recognise this. They referred to this farmed biodiversity, or agrobiodiversity, as they called it, at their 5th Congress of the Parties in 1992. And the definition they gave it was this, quote, all components of biological diversity of relevance to food and agriculture, and all components of biological diversity that constitute the agroecosystem, the variety and variability of animals, plants, and microorganisms at the genetic, species, and ecosystem levels, which are necessary to sustain the key functions of the agroecosystem, its structure, and its processes. So the point here is that our obligation to conserve biodiversity includes livestock and crops alongside their wild counterparts. And the point's reinforced by the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 2.5 says that signatories to the goals are expected to, quote, maintain the genetic diversity of seeds, cultivated plants, and farmed and domesticated animals. So it's the same point. There are these 2 substantial global obligations to which the UK is part, which require us to conserve farmed, kept animals. But unfortunately, at least as far as livestock is concerned, we are falling far short of meeting these targets. As the JNCC, the government's advisors on these sort of matters, said in its recent, or not recent, just over a year ago, report to the convention, as follows. Despite significant progress implementing strategies for the conservation of genetic resources, particularly for ex situ seed conservation, progress is assessed as insufficient in recognition of published declines in the effective population size of native animal breeds. So we've got this obligation to conserve native livestock, and we're falling short of it. But the point here that I want to go and get across is that native livestock are a part of biodiversity, and they need, and we are obliged to conserve them for much the same reason as native animals. Okay, but we shouldn't just be keeping native livestock because they will help facilitate our rewilding project, and we shouldn't just be keeping them because they are a part of biodiversity which we're obliged to go and keep as responsible global citizens. We should also be keeping them because of the reason that they came into being in the first place. And the reason that livestock exists is to meet human needs, whether that's providing clothing or food, or in the case of equines, transport or labour. They are there because they have a function. And I would suggest that as agriculture is changing, that function is going to become rather more relevant. Now, as most of you will know, the current form of farm support, the basic payment system, is being phased out, and going forward, farmers will no longer be paid on the basis of the amount of land they occupy, which is the case at present, but purely on the basis of the so-called public goods they deliver. So what does that mean for us? Well, I think the two big immediate issues are, first of all, farmers are no longer going to have the amount of money that they currently have to pay for expensive inputs. And secondly, they're going to find it difficult to compete on global commodity markets with all of those farmers whose systems are underpinned by subsidy in one way or another. And it's important to recognise that in most parts of the world, farming is underpinned by subsidy. It may not be called subsidy, it may be done by insurance or other methods, but there will be some form of state help which our farmers aren't going to have going forward. So what should farmers be doing to respond to that? Well, probably a whole range of things. But one thing I would suggest as being particularly appropriate is just to go and take a step back and start thinking about things from first principles. You know, if you recognise that livestock are there to meet human needs, start thinking about what those needs are, what can be done with your livestock, thinking about it in the round, and how you can run your livestock-based business as efficiently as possible. Perhaps one of the most important factors to appreciate here, and I'm about to go and use a phrase that I've stolen from Neil Heseltine, who I've just seen is on this conference, but if you're keeping the right breed at the right density in the right place, you will generally find that they can thrive without the expensive inputs. I'm thinking here of the feed and the vet and med bills that continental breeds depend on, thereby reducing your input costs. Moreover, because many native breeds are often associated with a specific location, and I'll be saying more about this later, with some savvy marketing, you can build on that local connection, making it a part of a bigger brand. Also, because consumer choices are increasingly being influenced by environmental and welfare concerns, you can highlight that many of those features are commonly associated with native breeds. They tend to have a lower environmental footprint because they're kept outdoor on grass at lower densities. The welfare concerns are less than you will find with the more intensive systems in which continental breeds are kept. You know, I'd even go as far as to say that you can address many of the concerns raised by vegetarian and vegan advocates about meat by referring to native breeds. The animals have a good life. They can generally express themselves naturally. They're not associated with the environmental externalities. If you've got the right infrastructure in place, they have a good a death as any animal. You know, these are all features which can be exploited when you're thinking about your business model. It'll all be part of the brand. And the attraction of this for the new world is none of the things I've referred to depend on government support. These are all things which can be done without subsidy. Now, that's not to say, though, that there is no role for government at all in this. There is, and I think that government can do much to support the native livestock sector in the new market-focused model it's shifting to. Perhaps the single most important issue here is to encourage the creation of a comprehensive network of local abattoirs. You know, the lack of such a network is one of the biggest challenges the native sector faces. Firstly, there's the numbers and distribution. There aren't enough abattoirs, and if there are, you can't guarantee they're in the right place. Well, they're not in the right place, which means people are having to go and drive absurd distances to get to an abattoir. But even if there is an abattoir, it needs to be able to cater for native livestock. It needs to be able to take and process small numbers of non-standard animals, which is what many native breeds with their horns and thick skins are. It also needs to be able to go and provide private kills facilities. Native breed farmers generally, as for the reasons I've said, provide premium products, and they operate outside the mainstream supply chain. They therefore need the carcass and all the byproducts, including the skin and the horns, to be returned to them. They are part of the brand. And in many cases, they underpin the level of profit. A few months ago, RBST ran an event called the Primitive Produce Project, which was showing how you could make money from keeping primitive sheep breeds. And this was that attitude. You had to go and make use of every part of the sheep. And with certain breeds, what made the difference between commercial and not commercial was being able to go and sell the horns, so that which could be used for in walking sticks and similar craft exercises. You know, it wasn't very much, the margins weren't great, but together it made enough to make keeping the breed financially sensible. I think that the way the livestock sector is going, because people will be moving to more sustainable systems, the abattoir network is going to have to go and change anyway. My worry is that it won't change quickly enough. So it's not a matter of asking for long-term subsidy. We're not talking about propping up an industry that's got no relevance or has less relevance anymore. It's purely about short-term capital investment to enable what remains of the existing network to meet changing needs. Or if there is no local facility, the investment needs to be in mobile or pop-up facilities, temporary abattoirs to meet local needs until more substantive infrastructure can be put in place. There also needs to be a review of the regulations to make sure they're proportionate. There really should be no more than is necessary to meet necessary welfare and safety requirements. Other areas for government to look at, I'll go into these in less detail, but we could do with a review of carcass grading. Under the current carcass grading system, the shape and fat cover of the animal are taken into account, but not the taste. And if you're selling food, particularly niche premium food, then taste, you would have thought, would be a pretty significant factor. This isn't to go and say that the nature of the meat is the only thing that affects taste. Of course, the hanging and the cooking will also be important, but taste does matter. And there are precedents for this approach. In Australia, under their system, each carcass is graded by an accredited grader who gives it an eating grade, so that consumers, purchasers, can get a sense of what they want. It would seem that outside the EU, this may be something that government should be looking at. Something else considering, abolishing what remains of the over 30-month rule. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, the OTM rule was introduced in, 20 years ago, in response to the BSE crisis. And basically it said that you could eat meat but as long as it was below 30 months, because at that age, it's extremely unlikely to have BSE. But there was a related measure, the SRM control, specified risk material control regulations, that require you to go and move the vertebral column over from any animal over 30 months. That still remains. It's a problem because, many native breeds take longer than 30 months to finish. And in any event, meat tastes better generally the older the animal is. The problem is removing the spinal column can cost up to an additional 50 quid, which can affect the financials of the arrangement. Now, we understand that the medical need for the SRM control has passed, but government haven't yet found the opportunity to get rid of the controls. It would be great if they could, so long as that point about the health justification no longer applying has gone. The last thing I think that would be useful for government to do is to introduce more honest labelling system. Now, I know whenever you talk to farmers, they will talk about the need for improved labelling systems. It does matter, but you shouldn't overestimate it. The amount of purchasing that is based on labelling, even if you include organic, is negligible, something like 6% by value. But it does make a bit of a difference. And in the native sector, our big frustrations are when you see stuff labelled as native breed lamb or traditional beef. These aren't things which have any legal meaning. They're just marketing terms. So what we are saying is that you should only be able to call your produce native or traditional if it's from a pedigree herd or flock registered in the herd book of a breed recognised as native by FANGA, the government's Farm Animal Genetic Resources Committee. And you should only be able to go and describe it as being rare if it's from a breed listed by that committee as being at risk. And moving on, the use of breed names should only be permitted in respect of meat from herds registered in the herd book for that breed. You know, if the meat is from a crossbred animal, which is fine, that crossbreeding should be expressly referred to. You know, just with those few measures, I think we could do a huge amount to move on the native breed sector and demonstrate an economic utility as much as the environmental and biodiversity drivers that I've already referred to. But aside from the economic and environmental benefits of native breeds, there's also a strong cultural side to them, which I think is, well, first of all, interesting and important in itself, but I also think can help make rewilding type projects much more attractive to the settled population in the area than might otherwise have been the case. Now, I'm sure some people on this conference were at there was a big conference in Canterbury just before the lockdown, and I think it was, yes, I'm pretty sure it was at this conference, and there was a speaker, a Welsh hill farmer, David Morris Jones, who is the farmer who is quoted at length in Feral, George Monbiot's book on rewilding. And he was saying that he regarded rewilding as a real threat to his and his family and his friends' way of life for a whole range of reasons. And one of the points he made, that there is no word for rewilding in Welsh. And someone from the audience challenged him and said, well, what would the Welsh equivalent for rewilding be? It can't be that you've got no language. And he came out with some phrase in Welsh, and the compere asked him to translate it directly. And he said, rewilding is something that London metrosexuals do to Welsh farmers, which of course brought the house down, but did demonstrate the level and the nature of the hostility. Whereas if it was couched more in terms of reviving, say, landscape scale wood pasture systems with native livestock, that might be more acceptable, particularly if those livestock are the ones which are associated with that part of the world. You know, and that isn't difficult to do. You know, Highland cattle are clearly associated with Scotland. Welsh blacks are associated with Wales. With ponies, it's even easier. You know, in so many cases, pony breeds are named after the area: Exmoor, Dales, Dartmoor. So it's almost to say it helps you get a foot in the door, or even gets you further, actually sort of through the door and into the hallway, if you're using the breeds that people who are already living there will regard as acceptable. But they can also have an excitement in themselves. You know, if you think of the White Park is the cow which forms the Rare Breed Survival Trust logo, and I'm sure you've seen it all over the place, or at least I hope you have. But these are a breed which came to Britain when it was still joined to the European mainland by what we now call Dogger Island. You know, we're talking about before Stonehenge was built. If you read the some of the early pre-Celtic poems of Ulster, their whole society seems to be based on these white cows. They talk about them being used in trade. They talk about them being used in religious processions and being sacrificed as part of religious rites. You know, the Cistercian monks chose to go and keep white cattle. The point I'm making here is that they've been part of our national culture for a huge amount of time. We recognise the importance of our built heritage and take steps to provide to preserve it, to conserve it, to find uses for it. The same should be true, I would suggest, of our livestock heritage. So really, there you have it. A whole range of reasons why, if you're thinking about rewilding, you should be thinking about native livestock. Not just because of the benefits they'll bring to you, but also because of the economic potential they have, and because, well, they can just make it easier. And perhaps the final point, which I will touch on very quickly, is that under the new Agriculture Bill, Agriculture Act, I should say now, government are going to reward people for keeping native livestock. There is a specific provision in Section 1 which allows the government to provide financial assistance for, quote, the conservation of native livestock and equines. We're still working out what that look like in practice, but I would suggest it's even another reason why you might want to keep them. So there you have it, a quick rush through, well, quite a long rush through, why you should be using native livestock. Thanks. Jeff.
Thanks, Christopher. I always find it encouraging to be reminded of the role of large herbivores in a sort of a spectrum approach to rewilding, which is really the kind of inclusive approach we try and take at Yorkshire Rewilding Network. So thank you for that. We've got quite a few questions to get through, so thanks for those that have already put them on. There's probably room for a few more. The first one is to ask to what extent farmers are, do you feel, looking more at native breeds as we approach the changes in subsidy and the increasing awareness of nature-friendly farming and rewilding?
I sense a lot. It's not for rewilding projects. It's because it's an economically rational thing to do. Farmers are going to be losing their basic payment. They will be paid for public goods. As they lose their basic payment, they're not going to have the money to pay for the expensive inputs that continental breeds depend on, or the vet and med bills that are often associated with those breeds. They're going to want to find hardier and thriftier breeds. And because those breeds were bred for our landscape, they fulfill that niche. In addition, it's going to be difficult to I suspect, to compete on global meat markets. So you're going to want something that's a bit more niche, and native breeds lend themselves to that because of the sense of place and some of the environmental welfare attributes they have them. So it all stacks up. You know, I'm not talking about every livestock farmer, and I'm sure there'll be some that want to go and keep their continental breeds in metal sheds forever. But I think that, you know, at the margin, things are changing, and that the challenges for the infrastructure, particularly abattoirs, to go and change at the same rate.
Thank you. At the opposite end of that scale, how quickly can rare breed numbers be increased if, you know, if this does take off? Is the stock there to breed up to satisfy numbers?
Funny enough, I had a fascinating discussion about this last week. As I suspect you know, every year RBST produces the watch list, which is a list setting out the conservation status of our rarest native breeds. For a long time, we've done it just on numbers, but this year we changed it so as to take into account the level of inbreeding, because obviously that affects the conservation status of the animals or the breeds just as much. And the main significance of this change of approach was it highlighted the threat to Gloucester cattle. Numbers-wise, they're not doing that badly, but most of them are owned by one person, or a lot of them are owned by one person, so there's a lot of inbreeding, and they're in a TB area. So the conversation was about how can we get as many new herds set up around the country as possible. And this was the single biggest obstacle. Can we do it quick enough to go and make a difference? You can extract the semen to go and put in gene banks and the like, but that doesn't get animals on the ground. So I suppose, in short, my answer would be it does depend a bit on the breed, but it becomes circular. The more the demand is, the more people will be wanting them and seeing the merits of breeding them.
Thank you. There are several questions now kind of related perhaps to smaller or medium scale rewilding projects where people aren't necessarily farming, but have got an interest in some input from herbivores. The first is about the use of tamwoods or other pigs to clear bracken that's taking over, there's a public access woodland. Is there evidence of using pigs to clear bracken working?
Absolutely, yes. And actually, if you're interested in this topic, we have got a blog on the RBST website, particularly about the use of pigs. We call it conservation grazing. Clearly, it's not grazing as such, but about the environmental impact of keeping pigs. And as I touched on when I was talking, people kind of assume they destroy everything, but they don't. They are a bit more selective than that. And if you're sure about what impacts you want, then pigs may be the ideal solution for you.
And is the public access element of that just suggesting, I'm thinking about containment and advice I've heard before about they're really difficult to keep in one place?
There is that, yes. They will move around a lot. They're safer to have than wild boar, which is why Charlie's got them at NEP. So yes, that there will be issues, or there is the risk of issues there.
Sure, but it's good for people to go and look at the RBST website for facts on there. That's great, thanks. For people that are novice livestock owners, how much of a range is there in terms of handlability, whether it's temperament or size? Can people get guidance on don't plump for something that's so wild and unmanageable that you're really going to have problems?
I mean, there's a whole range of factors you're going to want to go and take into account. Again, if you go onto our website, we've got a sort of an introductory checklist of things you might want to go and take into account when setting up a new grazing regime. Various factors depend on it, are relevant here. So yes, the size of the animal, whether it's got horns, can obviously be a significant factor. What its maternal instincts are like, is it going to fight everything to protect its young, or will it be a bit more nonchalant, pragmatic about things? But of course, there's other factors as well. The topography makes a huge difference. Some things will do okay on rocky, hilly ground. Some things won't. Some things are okay in wet, waterlogged ground. Some things aren't. There's various things that you need to go and take into account beyond just the sort of ease of handling type requirements.
Thank you. It's good, I think, for people to know that there is guidance out there as they're starting out the first time. Some sites that aren't massive kind of, I think, approach us with an interest in borrowing livestock or having someone come in and graze for a short period. How feasible is that? And are there potential issues if there are badgers around with TB, for example?
Yeah, I mean, TB is of course going to be an issue, and I'm sure everyone will have their own views on how TB is best managed that we probably don't want to get onto now. In terms of having animals for short-term grazing, yes, it does happen. I think most native breed keepers probably do own their animals and keep them on their own land throughout, but there are others, I suspect more commercial farmers who happen to use native breeds, who will be wanting to or content to move their animals around a little.
Okay, 2 questions relating to equines. How do you encourage people to use native equines in rewilding or conservation programs when there seems to be a large supply of conics being shed out between organisations?
Yeah, I don't know whether people are using conics because they think they're the right thing to do, or they think they're the right thing to do because there are so many of them. As I said, the reason that people seem to like them or want them is because they are thought to resemble and have the characteristics of the tarpan, which is the prehistoric pony, and certainly their head shape is similar. So I suppose on an aesthetic basis, there might be some justification. But you would hope people would be more rounded in the way they approach these things, and look at the functions. There's a reason why we have Exmoor ponies on Exmoor. There's a reason why we have Dartmoor ponies on Dartmoor. They've evolved to live on those habitats and have managed perfectly well for, well, in some cases thousands of years, in other cases hundreds of years. This idea that native ponies can't manage in wet habitats is just nonsense, particularly when you see where conics come from. It's not a wet part of Poland.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read this question verbatim. It's quite sort of specific and kind of, I think, illustrates the information that people look to get about their particular project. It says, which kind of ponies would you use for a rewilding project on the edge of the Scottish Highlands? Would a mixture of Scottish native breeds be a good idea? And what kind of native pigs? Are there any native Scottish pigs? So it's really quite specific, but I guess if people are looking to run a project, that's sort of the level of detail that they tend to be interested in.
Yeah, as I say, I mean, whilst you should always go for something that you like, and should probably start off by thinking about what you like, there are a range of site-specific, topographical specific things that you should take into account. In terms of where you would start within Scotland, I guess Eriskay would be the obvious, or one of the obvious choices, although not many of them, but they are well suited to the landscape. In terms of other native Scottish breeds, it does get difficult. Do you describe a Scottish native breed as something which is native just to Scotland, or do you talk about UK native breeds which you happen to go and find more of in Scotland? And does it really matter? As long as it's a native breed, we almost use native breed as a cipher. What we're really talking about is something that is able to thrive with limited, if any, human attention in that particular landscape, and they will by their nature tend to be native breeds, but you can get over specific about it.
Thank you. The last one that's on there at the moment goes back to the abattoirs issue and asking, do you think there's an appetite in government to provide solutions of smaller scale abattoirs, which seems vital in boosting the viability of small flock rare breed farming?
I would like to think so. It was last July, we and some other organisations, Sustainable Food Trust, possibly Pasture for Life, lobbied some peers to ask Lord Gardner, the relevant minister in the Lords, whether the agriculture bill could be used to support native abattoirs, and he said it could, but didn't say it will. Since then, we've been making the case to anyone who will listen. There is clearly a problem in government with bandwidth, that they are working incredibly hard to get ELM, the new environmental support system, out the door in time. And I'm sensing that that's resulting in less time being spent on other stuff. And actually, we were promised a whole load of business support type measures under the agriculture bill, none of which, well, others might be closer to it than me, but none of which seem to be reaching fruition. And I'd put abattoirs very much in that box. To put things on a more formal footing, about 2 months ago, we set up something called the Abattoir Sector Group, which is us, Sustainable Food Trust, the I can't remember what they're called, the Association of Local Abattoirs, or Craft Butchers Association, sorry, to make sure that our advocacy was a bit more focused and strategic. So hopefully that will start to go and make a difference. Anytime now, we're about to go and see the first pop-up abattoir, mobile abattoir being set up on a farm in Gloucestershire, and hopefully that will also go and provide a model for other solutions.
Great, thanks, Christopher. That's all the questions. So thanks ever so much for an enlightening talk. The Rare Breed Survival Trust is a charity, and I'm sure welcomes donations, as do we at Yorkshire Rewilding Network through our website. We've already had donations in during the talk, so thanks for that. And if anybody else would like to do so, they're very much appreciated. Our next webinar, and the last of our kind of winter series, if we can call it that, is on the 26th of May, where Rick Batterby will talk about pond creation and the importance of wetlands in biodiversity and the impact on rewilding. So I'd like to thank John for setting this up in the intro, especially to Christopher, and to the remainder 80 or so of you that have joined the webinar. If you missed any bits, we have recorded it. I remembered to press the button, so it will be on our website in coming days. Otherwise, thanks for your questions, for your participation, and I wish you a good evening. Bye for now.